Thanks, Kim, and thanks to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. We're looking forward to a really fantastic and dynamic conversation about the kind of risks that CISOs are facing in today's environment. Before we launch right into things, I want to give the panel a chance to make a quick introduction of themselves. We'll start with Andrea.
Yeah, hi everyone. Andrea Limbago. I lead the research and analysis at Interos, which is a supply chain risk company. And with quick background, I've worked in the Department of Defense for several years, taught in academia, and also have been in several cybersecurity startups, most recently Endgame and Virtue. So I'll be bringing in more of the broader perspective as far as what we're hearing across the range of industries and research in the area of third-party risk.
Debbie.
Yep, Debbie Briggs. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Netscout Systems, located in Boston, Mass area. Netscout is a high-tech company involved in security assurance and service assurance platform. And what I will bring to the table from a third-party perspective is I can speak both as the person who has third-party vendors and as a third-party vendor, what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling, and offer that experience.
Excellent. Monica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Keeneth. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Inovalon, a healthcare technology company based outside of Washington, D.C. and Bowie, Maryland. I am accountable for corporate security as well as cybersecurity and security governance, so I can give a broad perspective of all of the security programs. I have operated in a heavily regulated industry, so have a lot of different perspectives on audits and oversight and vendors. And also, I like to say that I give it and I receive it. We audit vendors as well as are continuously audited by our clients, so I can give both sides as well.
Outstanding. And rounding it out, Vicky.
Good afternoon. I'm Vicky Ames. I'm the Director of Information Security, Risk and Compliance at United Therapeutics. We're a biotech firm, also just outside of DC in Silver Spring, Maryland, and other locations. So that's where our headquarters are. We're trying to solve the problem of pulmonary arterial hypertension, as well as the problems of the unavailability of donor organs. So pretty broad perspective here. It actually is World Pulmonary Hypertension Day. For those of you out there, we're celebrating that there are therapies coming every day, and there is focus on this disease. So I'm also in a very heavily regulated industry and have third-party, fourth-party, even fifth-party vendors that I have to deal with on a frequent basis, and can bring some of that perspective as well as some of the in the trenches work that we're doing today to try to manage it all.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. And just to round things out, as Kim mentioned, again, my name is Janelyn Schreiber. I am a partner at Data Privacy and Security Advisors, and we are a consulting firm that focuses not only on the security, but also the privacy space, helping companies deal with a host of regulatory issues and data protection. So to kick things off, without further ado, where I thought it would make sense to start this afternoon is in taking a slightly broader view of the risk that CISOs are contending with right now. There's absolutely no question that cyber attacks are up dramatically. Third-party risk is absolutely more of a focus, hence our topic today. But there's also fourth-party risk, and as Vicky mentioned, even in some cases, fifth-party risk. And this is some things that teams aren't necessarily completely dialed into or really have an understanding of how to navigate. And so I thought when we're taking a look at what CISOs are contending with, starting out by understanding how can CISO teams start to understand and navigate the entire risk ecosystem. And I thought, Andrea, would be a perfect place for you to take us from.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it is, we're increasingly seeing, CISOs who are already, overburdened and have a ridiculous amount of work on their hands defending against the threats that we've been seeing over the last few years. But on top of that, we're seeing CISOs basically become broader risk managers as well for a whole range of risks that are coming in. And it isn't just a third party, like you mentioned. It's extending into fourth and fifth tier and so forth, because looking at an entire supply chain ecosystem of a company, global brands can have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of suppliers across their supply chain. And so gaining visibility on that is extraordinarily difficult. And so that alone is a really big challenge. And then when you think about how the threats are evolving on that aspect, as far as digital supply chain attacks, for instance. I mean, that we've seen that with SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange. It's nothing that's new. We can go back decades and see some of the various aspects of supply chain attacks going on, but there's becoming much more prominent. And we've seen them have a really big impact. And one of the big areas we're seeing is that they actually also are leading to increased regulations and compliance starting to come in as well, which also is becoming under the purview of the CISOs. And in the United States, there's an executive order on supply chains that's going to come out that could very well be something that impacts, or the supply chains already came out that's probably going to impact CISOs, but an executive order on cybersecurity as well, supposed to come out any day from what I've been reading. And that also will integrate aspects as far as data breach notification, what kind of controls are needed. And so that will also be something that falls under CISOs. And if that's not enough, within the broader supply chain, increasingly, certain vendors are not allowed to be within your supply chain for a really dynamic industrial policy that's going on in the United States. And it's not just in the United States, this is happening actually across a lot of the democracies across the globe, where they're saying certain companies are not allowed to be in your supply chain anymore for a range of risks. And they could be security risks, they could fall under a human rights violation component, they could be military end users. And so all these broad range of factors are starting to fall under the umbrella of what CISOs have to deal with. And just for one example, for the US, under the Commerce has a whole range of restricted entities lists. And it's been over 300 different companies from China alone in the last 2 years that have been added to that list. And so that's where you get into the dynamic threats, you get the dynamic regulatory environment, and then just this growing purview of what the CISOs are in charge of just makes it a really hard and complex environment right now. And I think we hear that a lot sort of in the marketing area as far as, so it's the most dynamic regulatory and threat landscape ever. But it really is. And if you look at what happened in 2020 really was an inflection point in so many different areas. My background's in international relations, for education. And, I would look at 2020 the same way I look at like 45 or 1989, as far as a really big shift in the way the world is evolving. And CISOs are going to be the ones that are really going to have to help bring their companies along in handling those shifts.
Absolutely. And this strikes me, Andrea, just to build on what you were saying, something that Vicky had brought up when we were chatting in prep for the panel, which is the fact that the purview of the CISO is now extending so dramatically beyond just the information security, where we're starting to have to take into consideration these different aspects of businesses, including financials and other kinds of areas that are a challenge. I thought, Vicky, you might be able to expand on that as we keep going.
Sure. So, when third-party risk comes up, everybody points at the CISO and says, hey, third-party risk, you take care of it. And when I did that initially, I said, well, of course, I can take care of it from a cybersecurity perspective, and I can start talking with people about that. And then I quickly found out there's an expectation that it isn't just that sliver. It's kind of, oh, by the way, here's all the third-party risk stuff. Tell us about their financial health. Tell us about all the other risks that we have out there. So it's a much broader risk management proposition, I think, than I had really originally anticipated. And it's somewhat legitimate, but what I've done is I've tried to partner with the various folks and trying to identify, from a supply chain perspective, who the critical people are that could really materially affect our company, right? So you can't do this. You can't do this for all third parties. You can't understand third parties from a technology standpoint to some degree, but when you're talking about doing the level of analysis that you really want to do and focusing in on making meaningful risk judgments, you need to focus in on the ones that are critical to the organization. I can't tell them that. So I have risk meetings with them constantly to try to figure out who our critical suppliers are, and then we can find out how they could affect us. And then we can start talking with them about how we can go about understanding what we need to make sure that we're putting the appropriate mitigations in place if needed, or at least understand.
Oh, Debbie, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here for a second. So one of my thoughts to what Vicky and Andrea said was, they're both spot on. And Vicky, you brought up, you can't boil the ocean. You've got to take a risk-based approach to the vendors that you were looking at. Completely agree with that. You've got to start with your highest risk first. The hardest point in a big changing point at the end of 2020 was SolarWinds. I mean, not only so I lucked out, we didn't use SolarWinds, so I was on the purview sort of looking in. But is a company that both asks questions and receives third-party risk questions. A lot of our customers were like, sending these security questionnaires. Do you use SolarWinds? Were you impacted? What did you do? And and you take a step back before that. And, if I was doing a risk assessment of SolarWinds, or it doesn't matter who it is as a software developer, I don't think I would have asked them questions about the security of their development. I definitely wouldn't be asking Microsoft that. I would have expected that, if Microsoft's doing best in breed practices, but maybe that's not good enough. And I'm not quite sure where we go from here, ladies, because, I wouldn't have asked a vendor about their software development lifecycle. I may have asked if they had a secure one, but other than that, I'm not sure I would have had too many other questions for them. So that's a big shift that came up that I think, we're going to feel fallout for all of this year.
Yeah, building on what Debbie just said, in our organization, we risk rank all the vendors based on their access to our infrastructure, right? A system like SolarWinds would be an internal application. So, the risk profile is lower than a company that's hosted or has your data, right? Within our organization, you can't boil the ocean. You have to pick the high risk groups, and you have to focus on those are the ones you're going to put your resources toward auditing and verifying their programs. So, I agree completely. Like we would look at a company that it's a software solution internally to our infrastructure as lower risk. And, as shown by SolarWinds, that's something that, we can't consider in that same category anymore. We have to look at it from a different perspective. And I think one of the things, building on some of the conversation earlier, is that, third-party risk is a partnership across the organization. We work really closely with our procurement team and our legal team. So, security does a security risk assessment on vendors, but we're not in it alone. It's a legal and it is a procurement effort as well to kind of vet these vendors. And so, I think that partnership has been really helpful into making sure, one, that we have an accurate list and we understand the universe of vendors out there, but ultimately to make sure that we're adequately assessing the risk and the impact to the company.
And I want to jump in and ask a question of the panel sort of broadly, and looking forward to hearing what you guys are saying. One of the elements, again, that I find as I'm working with my clients that they're sort of stymied by and realize, oh dear, I have a bigger problem here than I thought, is on that fourth party, on the vendor of your vendors. To what extent are you guys, or maybe even more relevant, given the pandemic and given the way in which everybody's paradigm has shifted to work from home, including vendors, which of course changes the risk profile, to what extent have you started to integrate, or have you always been evaluating the vendors of your vendors, those third and fourth and fifth party risk components to the core program? I don't know who wants to start. Just come on.
I can start. From our perspective, a lot of what we do is and so there's clinical trials, and so our primary concern is ensuring that data privacy is paramount for all of these activities. And so we take a lot of efforts to make sure that when we are delivering data, it is in no way attributable back to a single individual. And that's kind of how we decided to mitigate it. And luckily, from a scientific research perspective, that's an easy do, because they tend to be blinded already and they tend to be anonymized. So from that perspective, prevention beats cure, right? And we are taking a look. Again, it all for us comes back to asking the folks that are using these vendors, what is the effect that they could have to our bottom line? And we look at risk from a perspective of, will this materially affect our business? Will this keep us from meeting business objectives? Will this keep us from, successfully launching this product or looking at this study? So we've kind of come up with some areas in how we frame it and focus the discussions, because a cybersecurity breach, and I will say that there have been third party and fourth party things that I'm aware of where there have been ransomware outbreaks, and it has not affected us. And the deal is that you need to know that is probably going to happen, and just look at what they're doing for your organization. And should ransomware or some other type of event occur, what would that really mean to you? And talk about that with your stakeholders so that you can understand that. And then if there would potentially be a significant issue, then we're going to go start talking to them and talking to the business folks and making sure that they are then talking to those people, and we can talk with security teams. But ultimately, it's a trusting conversation, right? I will go talk to the CISO of that organization and let's say, we have this covered. I can show you this report. I can show you this audit. Great. And that's wonderful. And there's a level of comfort there, but there isn't a whole lot of prevention, I think, that we can do. But we can have the conversations and do our best to communicate impact across and talk with other professionals about it and hope at the end of the day that we're all here to do the same job.
So Vicky, the one add to that I would be is when you look at beyond your third parties is the one ask that you do need to ask your vendors is, where are they hosting your data? 5 years ago, it was on premise in their data center. And nowadays that probably isn't the case. So, I think if you had to ask, like, what's your first question you should ask your third parties that may have your data is, where does that data live? And is it in on-prem? Is it in a public cloud? Is it in a private cloud? And I think those are discussions that you have to have. If I had to say what one question is important that you understand about your third parties, it would be, where are they keeping your data if they have any?
Great point.
Yeah, and building on that, in our group, what we do is we essentially classify those as tier 1 vendors. So any tier 1 vendor, we would make sure that we have a good understanding of their vendors that would potentially have access to our data or be subcontractors. And we have security addendums and contractual commitments in place that anyone who can access our data has to abide by the same contractual requirements that we've imposed on that vendor. But I think for me, really the area that is more of a question mark is the ones that don't have direct access to your data, but are now imposing new risks to the ecosystem that we haven't really managed as tightly previously.
And I'll say, and I think it's super interesting with Monica coming from a very super regulated industry. It's just interesting to see, because I think knowing to ask those kind of questions, as far as even having the controls on there for who can access the data, there've been in research that I've done and just discussing and talking to various companies across different industries, so many just have very little idea of where their data is and who has access to it. They may know initially to their first tier, but the first tier often can share it with their suppliers and so forth as needed, and they basically lose track of the data once it gets once it leaves their own ecosystem. So it's interesting, and it's one of those components that I think absolutely, to Debbie's point on where's your data hosted, and then even on top of on-prem, is it in the cloud? Is it physically outside the United States, right? Because then it becomes, all of a sudden there are all these different regulations. There are governments right now that are passing laws that are mandating access to data, and they're mandating localized storage of the data. And depending on the country, there's going to be some enormously different risks as far as if it's stored abroad. And so it's just really that again, getting back to the diversity of what's going on across the globe, and just knowing where your data is increasingly a top concern. But to Vicky's point as well, as far as trying to figure out who your initial suppliers are, and maybe going on beyond that, so many companies just still don't know who their suppliers might be and what kind of questions to ask them, as far as what kind of products they have. And so I think on the one hand, technology can help with that, but there is also so much, to your point, as far as the information sharing and the communication, and that's where we need to start thinking about this as a team, really. We're all going to be stronger together if we all are elevating our security together, and knowing who you partner with and ensuring that they're also not going to be the weakest link within your data ecosystem. That's just essential, because if you have the best security, but your suppliers or your suppliers don't, that's the way in, and that's what we've seen just over and over again. And that from a attacker's perspective, that's the easiest way in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrea. And we actually have a question from the audience, and I'd like to take this quick second to remind everybody, please do submit questions. I am keeping an eye on them and will absolutely toss them into the panel. But the question actually dovetailed nicely on what we've just been talking about, which is, what are some of the approaches to manage that fourth party security in terms of, how can you secure your data spillage risk and other kinds of considerations that need to be taken. And I guess one of the questions that I'd like to throw out to the panel is, are we now in such a complex, interconnected ecosystem, as we've been saying, that traditional risk assessments as we've known them, are they effective anymore? And if not, are there some other ways in which we can sort of pivot on that? Maybe it's, to Andrea's point, bringing in more members of the organization more broadly who are going to be using these vendors. But what's sort of your perspective on ways in which to effectively manage it? And is the paradigm of the good old-fashioned risk assessment maybe something for the rearview mirror?
I'll take first pass at that. I think that we're at a flux point, or a pivot point. The risk assessments from previous years, just that we found out there's a whole bunch of missing questions about fourth party, and we took a look. And I don't want to keep throwing SolarWinds under the bus, but it is such a learning point for all of us that we had, not that there's someone hadn't considered it, but we didn't consider it such a risk that it was something we needed to look at. And it's like history repeating itself. 5 years ago it was Target and an HVAC vendor, and so we have a way of how we protect people who need access to our physical infrastructure, but they don't need access to our data, and how to protect that. And I think we're at that pivot point. And Monica, I would love to know what you're thinking about how how you're thinking about changing that pivot. I know if one of my third parties gets breached, I have breach notification. But what if one of their third parties or one of their vendors get breached? Does that still fall under the breach notification that they have to tell me? And so I think we may have to clear some of that up in legal language. But Monica, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, thank you. On our side, we're really particular about data is really the driver for notification. So any subcontractor or vendor that can access our data, if there's something that happens, the notification trickles down. And that's pretty clear in our agreements. But to your point of the grayer area where it might not be a direct correlation, where maybe they're not contracted to do something with your data, but then at the same time you have a software solution in your infrastructure that then gets breached, right? That's where I think there's a little bit more ambiguity around where the notification requirements come up. I do feel that security certifications and audits are a good foundation, but it's not enough. It's an independent validation of controls. You still want a company to have controls in place. You want somebody to check those controls, right? Everyone always says compliance is a floor, not a ceiling. Having those compliance certifications, et cetera, still are a good foundation to understanding a company's security posture, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture, right? That's really where you have to look more broadly at the company from other ways as well. We found that we like to do on-site audits with some of these vendors, especially if they're a high-risk vendor. And, just talking to people, you're able to get a lot more information about a security or risk posture of a company than somebody sending you a template of a 200-page questionnaire. So the questionnaire might be a good starting point of areas you want to hone in on, but ultimately, I think just having that relationship, having that dialogue, and being able to get that information from multiple sources, even outside that company, of what's their reputation, what are they, what's their external internet presence look like? Those kind of things can help in weighing the risk of a vendor or a company.
And Vicky, Andrea, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts, but something else I'd like to weave in on this is also whether or not you guys require, in terms of Monica's comment on compliance being the ceiling, rather the floor, not the ceiling. a question had come in from the audience about requiring SOC 2s for your vendors. What's the perspective on additional mechanisms? Probably not the final say so. There's always that trust but verify, but I'm curious to what extent that's a make it or break it component for you as you're looking at third parties, and sort of what role those kinds of independent audits play for you. So Vicky, I'll kick it to you on that one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so we are not requiring SOC 2s. We do use a service product, whatever, that actually does do some of the preliminary risk assessment for us. We send out, the questions to folks that are relevant to us. So rather than going through a large audit, we try to do some of that pre-certification that Monica was talking about, and just understanding where they are and what their baseline is. And then from there, we can go in and talk to them about any kind of specifics or concerns that come out of that initial questionnaire. So, I'm a security, we're a 1,000-person company. I'm a security team of 2. So we leverage vendors and other services when we can. So, when we need to, we'll actually send folks over there to do audits, but we reserve that just for our real high risk folks, vendors.
And I will say, I think that people have high expectations on how big security teams are for a lot of these companies, even for some of the big ones. And I think that's where, one of my biggest pet peeves is, sort of the blaming the victim for these attacks because they didn't do X, Y, and Z. And then you turn out they've got, 2 people for thousands of people for, thousands of people. And so it's, it's not quite as easy as they just should have patched. They should have done this. They should have just done that. And so that's, one aspect of it. But then also, as far as going back to the audits, I think is going forward, they're necessary but not sufficient. So whereas for a while they were, it was enough, it's no longer sufficient to do those, but you can't get rid of them at the same time. And so that's where they provide some value, they provide good utility. I think very often, when anyone's going to be assessing themselves, we all get A's, so you have to be wary of that, and go in and do some of your own research as well to augment it or to validate. You can. Sometimes you do have to, just trust, because of minimal resources, but when possible, absolutely starting to expand the notion in the sort of the realm of what you're looking at when looking at both current suppliers, future suppliers, and just partners in general, because that all becomes one interconnected ecosystem.
And, a follow-on to that with respect to the use of the assessments and follow-on and to Monica's points on site visits and more intensive audits, what kind of frequency do your teams, so everybody is resource limited, cash limited, and absolutely time limited. So with that being the case, when you get an assessment back and there are flags, do you embark on remediation programs with these vendors? Is there, depending upon how they score, a trigger to reassess within a shorter period of time than you might for other vendors? How does some of the responses in? Because one of the other things that I see my clients get challenged by is it takes a lot of effort to get the questionnaire out, and then it comes back in and everybody sort of looks at it dumbfounded and realizes there's a whole lot more work to do now and how. So I'm wondering how you guys are handling that or navigating that challenge internally.
I can jump in. Hi, Monica, Keeneth here. We do have a pretty robust oversight program where we track remediation plans through our GRC tool with vendors where, as a result of our reviews, if we have recommended enhancements to their security programs, that is something that we manage. I do have a larger team, I guess, compared to the rest. I have about 38 people. So by all means, I am not 200 people, and there's still always limitations around prioritizing exactly what you want people to focus on. But at the same time, the real way that we're able to kind of focus on high risk vendors, those tier 1 vendors, that's really where we'll do that additional management and oversight on, not necessarily the universe of the 5,000 people we might buy chairs from, right? It's going to be the people who can access the data, who have a connection to our infrastructure, who are hosting our data. Those are the people that we're really interested on making sure that they comply with our contractual agreements. And those agreements are really critical, mandating that we have a security addendum with every vendor that's in those tiers. We also do an annual attestation where every year they have to certify they still comply and then submit audit reports. We do actually require audit reports for all vendors. So it doesn't have to be a SOC 2. We accept like 5 different kinds of frameworks, but we do mandate an audit report is a minimum barrier to doing business with our company.
So I will take the approach from the other side. So Monica, I know you and I both, and I assume the others do too, send and receive requests for audits. It's hard to scale. It really is. I mean, we have a big customer, and most of our customers have the ability to audit annually. And that's one of the things that, you know, if someone wants to audit, I make sure I redline it and say limited to annually. But this one audit takes 80 hours because, you know, it's 600 questions and then they go through it. And if something is critical, you have a 30-day remediation period. If something's in high, you have a 60-day or 90-day remediation period. It took us, I mean, because we tracked this, 80 hours for that one customer. It's an important customer, but, you know, that doesn't scale. And, you know, that's where I think we're at this pivot point of, you know, the audits aren't perfect. Andrea, you said, you know, it's sort of like, you know, the audit or having a certification puts you on the guest list, but it might not get you invited to the party. And the question is how can we do something like that so you're not answering audits from every one of your customers? You know, is there something in the future? I mean, maybe if someone's, you know, an entrepreneur and hears this, goes, oh, I know what we can all do and can solve world peace here. But there's got to be a better way. There has to be a better way. And Andrea, you laughed at me.
No, I completely agree. That's that's why the world peace that'd be great. Absent that, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's not scalable, right? At this point, this is where, you know, I'm a big believer that I do think, you know, moving forward, it's going to take a combination of technology solutions to go through some of this, as well as the human dimension as far as the information sharing, making sure there's timely information that is getting shared to the appropriate people. And all, like, both, I actually would argue both are really hard to figure out. But I do think that, you know, the way technology is advancing and the way we are, you know, progressing with, you know, various kinds of modeling, I think we can get to a point where we can automate some of those aspects versus having to go through and have a person spend 80 hours. I mean, again, I think we talked about this in one of our prep, that that's 80 hours, they're not securing their system. You know, it takes them, again, there's their opportunity cost. And maybe it may not be like a 1-for-1 exactly, but, you know, it takes them away from doing other things at the end of the day. And so absolutely, I do think, and again, to the pivot point, like I just, the world that we left, you know, there's some aspects of it that are continuing on, but we're going into a very different world order, both because of geopolitically, the way the technology is changing, the way that we're restructuring supply chains in the light of all the disruptions of last year. We are going to have to lean on new solutions and new ways to help address this. What we did before just isn't going to cut it in the new world.
Yeah, one of the things I have seen is that there are organizations out there that are taking the various and sundry frameworks and requirements and mapping them to one another. So if you can get a superset of questions that you want to ask and answer, then you can kind of pre-do an audit. I mean, we'd all have to kind of agree this is okay, right? But if we can say that this vendor over here has done it and my answers to this question also meet your this audit question from this perspective and all there, we get kind of a somewhat easier method of saying, well, I answered these questions last time for this other vendor. I only need to answer these 4 net new questions that I haven't previously answered in this audit cycle. And then we need a platform to store all that information on that then people can access. We can say, hey, you can have access to this, or you can't have access to this, or whatever. I think that's kind of where we all have to kind of get to. And we have to get to a point where we don't treat each vendor like a very unique entity, but at least try to find the common values that we can all kind of agree. Everybody needs to answer these questions. And then if it's a really high risk, I add these questions in, and they've already answered 95% of these, and I can see it all on my single platform. that would be great.
Vicky, we do have a tool that does that. We've got the question and answers. And the interesting thing is like occasionally, because it's a security audit, I will be asked about the HR background process. Mm-hmm. You know, if it's not a written document, I can't remember. That's not my, forte. So I have to go back and ask. But the cool thing about this tool is it allows me to ask that question to the HR person and on an annual basis go out and vet that answer. So there are tools out there. It's a level of effort to get everything installed, but it's a benefit, but it doesn't solve the complete problem.
Agreed, but certainly, the time that you put in up front to get that up and running, right? Maybe that's that 80 hours you would have spent doing that work, and then you're saving yourself that 80 hours every large audit over the next 3 or 5 years, right? So it does turn into like economies of scale, in other words. So you do all the effort up front once, and then just kind of put it on annual updates. That's fantastic, Debbie.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Monica.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, everyone I think probably has a standard question bank and responses that you get for commonly asked security questions. I mean, I know my company, we get hundreds and thousands of questions a year. And so, we obviously have gone through the process many times and we get audited very frequently as well. And it is a huge level of effort. It depends on the size of the client and what they're doing. But ultimately, if a client does have audit rights, we're here to support them. At the end of the day, our job that's part of the security program is basically demonstrating the effectiveness of it to our clients to give them the comfort to continue to do business with us, right? To some extent, we do leverage our audits. So if a client says, hey, we want to pull examples of your backup tapes, and we're like, this control's tested in our SOC 2 right here, we're not going to pull a sample of backup tapes. There's times where you can get efficiencies for those kind of things, right? Where you have an independent validation of a specific control. But to that extent, I think it varies by industry too. Like I'm in a highly regulated industry. So, there's certain things that are going to be the standard and that we're not going to be able to push back on. And then maybe in other industries, there's more flexibility.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback on that, Monica, I think to add to what everybody's been saying is that there is some merit in organizations and to listeners out there who are joined us to think about ways in which to start to aggregate these answers, because as we talked about, there is the opportunity to sort of map it across different audits and different certifications that are out there. But since I dabble in both the privacy and the security space, I can tell you that the privacy regulations that are out there are becoming ever more focused on the security component. And so you'll find that there are going to inevitably talk about the CISO wearing many hats. In addition to the HR questions that Debbie's contending with, there will be an increase in privacy questions. And particularly, again, as we take a look at the location, as Andrea mentioned, data localization and some of those challenges are on the horizon for many organizations where you may very well be looking at a scenario where you, even in the cloud, can't have that data come out of country. And so all of a sudden, multinationals are really sitting back and going, how do we make this effective? How do we find proper vendors to help us address this? And then more importantly, how do we put the proper controls in place to make sure what we're entrusting them with is actually secure? But just to pivot a little bit and maybe drill in a little bit more on that kind of a concept, one of the questions from the audience was whether or not you guys have different types of approaches. And I think this is a SolarWind-esque kind of a question, but different approaches that you consider when you're purchasing hardware versus software. Anybody? Any takers? Or is it all the same?
I mean, I'll jump in for us. We treat it all the same. I think typically we're not buying hardware, at least in our business model as a technology company, without a software component to it, right? It's to support a technology solution. So I think in different industries, the answer might be different. But if you're in that high risk vendor category, we go through the same process with every vendor.
And actually, I read the question wrong. The question was whether or not it's different purchasing services versus purchasing hardware or software. So slightly different take, but not sure if Vicky or Debbie, you guys have a different approach on the services versus the hard or software side.
I think if you're purchasing services, it's important to understand how they're going to treat that data. More importantly, those HR questions. Do you have background checks? If they're hosting the data, do you own the encryption key or do they own the encryption key? How many of their people, if they own the encryption key, then anyone in the company that has access to your data can have access to your data. And I think those are things that are important. I think, if it's services, you're going to want to know, I would be looking for a SOC 2. I want to know, do they do security awareness training? Do they do background checks and items like that? I mean, if I was going to procure, we're a cloud first company. So to Monica's point, we're really not purchasing a ton of hardware, but if I was purchasing a router, I really, not that I wouldn't care, but does the hardware vendor do security awareness training? Wouldn't be top of mind, or do they do background checks? So I really think you have to look at, are you buying a piece of metal software, which is the technology, or if it's services, you're buying people. And their brain and their power and all their human errors built in. So it's understanding the controls and how they vet their employees would be important to me.
Yeah, I agree, Debbie. They're different risk profiles to my mind, and like you said, I'm much more concerned about making sure that I'm getting the right people when I'm procuring services rather than hardware, software, which is just a completely different set of questions.
Yeah, I agree. On our side, we look at services or even sort of a staff augmentation role differently, where we would classify them in a different tier. So we would be more focused on that validation of a background check and their reference checks, and then any other permissions or access or more human elements to the services they provide.
I'll say, as far as one of the broader trend, though, as far as especially on the hardware, but also in the software, just again is where it's coming from. That's going to increasingly be something that we have to consider. Again, it's shifting. We're getting into these technospheres where only certain kinds of technologies are going to be allowed within the supply chains in the United States, and so there's going to be additional scrutiny on that. And then conversely, as looking at some of the sort of the push factors as well, it'd be interesting to watch the software bill of materials and whether some legislation comes out on that this year. And that can actually, I would argue, you can help highlight and make, CISO's jobs a whole lot easier to find out what's actually going into a lot of the software that's getting made, all the code and the components. And so ideally, down there, I think where there's gonna be a lot of legislation coming in that will both make some aspects of a CISO's job easier and then some harder, unfortunately.
And speaking of challenges to the CISO's job, I know that one of the big challenges that it faced, will go completely pandemic focused here. We've largely not, and I think it is at least timely to raise some of the challenges. And I'm curious what kinds of experiences the team on the phone has had with respect to the immediate paradigm shift from in-person to work from home, and how that has forced businesses, in order to basically stay up and running, to adapt new technology that might have been on the horizon or might not have ever been considered. So many businesses are but in seat businesses, that remote work really wasn't something that was on the horizon as being tested or vetted. And I'm curious how you guys have found challenges internally managing expectations of the business and of leadership with the time necessary to appropriately vet the security of new systems and technologies and even services that you're integrating into your programs now. So it's a big one. So I won't call on anybody and put them on the spot, but you're more than welcome to sort of chime in terms of what's worked or what it's been like.
I'll jump in first. So our company, we were remote enabled prior to the pandemic, so we didn't have to get any additional technologies. I think it was more just pressure testing them and saying that, the whole workforce is now remote versus it being a portion of the workforce. Beyond that, we had already vetted those technologies from a security perspective, and we'd already hardened them and assessed them and penetration tested them and vetted them in multiple ways. So from that perspective, I would say the pandemic's challenges for me is really more around human training elements and ensuring that, we're doing more phishing awareness and account campaigns, because there's more scam calls, there's more people impersonating individuals. There's, even if it's in your personal life, if you're a victim of identity theft in your personal life, it can bleed into your work environment because you might be targeted more, or you might have, some of your information they can leverage to try to use in nefarious ways. So with that being said, I think the risks from the pandemic to at least our organization were really more of a human element and the training side of that. We did do phishing exercises with people. We do real-time world phishing exercises if someone falls for it. We have lots of training in that area as well. I'll open it to the floor for the others.
And actually, I'll even piggyback on, just in case anybody that was a little bit too close to home to touch on, is to sort of build on the training and how you guys are integrating that in, because I would imagine that even if there is a rush to put in new technology and it does get vetted and there is the time, there's still the learning curve. And then that obviously introduces the risk of staff being susceptible to the phishing emails, to phishing phone calls, to other kinds of scams. And we were saying before the panel started, these guys are very creative in terms of how they are looking to penetrate companies. And so what is, and this is also a question from the floor, and what are the most effective techniques that you found with respect to the cyber awareness training?
I think the awareness training needs to be timely, and it needs to happen more than once a year. Agree with exactly what Monica said. You've got to, you have to look at what the threat landscape is, and you have to pivot and adjust how you're going to do security awareness training. And, some people really like the, sit here for an hour once a year and get through it. But there are other generations that like the videos and, the more comedic type of security awareness training. And I think part of that gets to knowing who your customer and your employees are. I think one of the things that COVID-19 has really paused and made us think about is, we were very similar to you, Monica. One day we were in the office, the next day we all had our laptops home VPNing in. Well, as a CISO, I was never concerned about your home network at work. Some of our security awareness campaigns and training last year was, links to, how to secure your home router and how to do different things. I never wanted to get into that business. I just think that's a little bit of a slippery slope. But guess what? We now have, 3,000 people working in their homes that we didn't before. So things that before I may not have wanted to do, last year called for it. And I think my concern is, what did my third parties do? And, that's, we put a real push, don't store things locally, put everything up on a shared drive or in the cloud, because we didn't want to have to deal with, data in people's homes. So we made that conscious decision, but people did what they needed to do to get their job. And now we just need to ensure that, as we look at a reopening plan, that we're looking to where our data did end up and how we make sure that it comes back with the proper controls. And I think those are questions we're going to have to ask, not all our vendors, those key vendors, you're going to have to ask them that.
I would say, go ahead, Vicky.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Andrea. Okay. I was very fortunate in that we were a relatively mobile workforce anyway, so that when the pandemic hit, we were prepared, and we actually did some roundtabling ahead of time to make sure that we identified any gaps that we might have, but we knew our VPNs were already, ready to go for like the full company using them. Again, 1,000-person company, I have, some areas where it's easier for me to do these things than, 200,000-person companies. But so we do focus predominantly, our security awareness training is mostly delivered and aimed at preventing phishing attacks, right? Because if you look at the numbers, you look at the data, that is how the folks are getting in. And that is where your users really, I see that the users really need to be trained, because it's so easy to slip. And we do regular not in person, but we actually pay companies to come in and do social engineering attacks. So not just doing the routine from the vendors, which some of them are excellent at delivering. Now they've gotten to the point where they really deliver high quality phishing exercises, not some of the low hanging fruit that you're seeing. They'll just train them to actually recognize those. Rather than training them to recognize phishing. So some of the vendors have really accelerated their efforts and put out some good stuff. But we also ask companies to come in and actually try to do live exercises. And that has borne some significant fruit where we can then think about how we need to focus training year over year.
I'm saying that actually is a good sort of microcosm of what I've seen, and just the point that not all training is the same. I think too often training gets treated like compliance, and so you have a training, you go through a PowerPoint, they literally can just hit forward and then they get their certificate. Like that's not going to do it. And that, unfortunately, for too often, it becomes, it's just treated like a compliance aspect. Like it really just needs to become something, security needs to become part of the culture. And some of what's been interesting, again, over the last year, there really has been, I think, some good innovation on the training side. I mean, some good, interesting, gamification from some certain vendors, which draws in, parts of the workforce, like Debbie was talking about. There's other areas you have something in person, like what Vicky was talking about, is better for other areas of the workforce. And that's why you need this multi-pronged approach, and it's not something that is a one and done. It really has to be something that is continuous throughout the entire year. And again, gets back to the point where the incentives for actually reporting what you think might be something versus trying to hide it. And that's where you see, again, like you don't want to be, there's still too much concern about getting punished if you did something wrong versus the openness and the incentives to actually say, here, I may have done something wrong, or here, this looks a little bit odd. And so you have to think about those kind of aspects as well when doing sort of a holistic approach. And RSA is coming up, and I was looking at a presentation coming up that talks about how CISOs work with HR on this and doing some new organizational shifts that are going on. And that's how one company went forth and really was able to implement a security culture. And so I do think, again, unfortunately, adding more to the CISO, but like having relationships across the different departments really can help out a lot in this area.
Yeah, definitely. In our area, one thing we do incrementally as well is more grassroots campaigning, where I'll stop by somebody's all hands meeting, or, I'll go to the clinical staff meeting or something to just remind people about phishing. So yeah, we send emails. Yeah, we do tests. Yeah, we do training, but sometimes just talking for 5 minutes in someone's staff meeting also can be a big difference between someone saying, oh, I get it, or I'm going to think about that more, versus it just being another email they click through.
Exactly. And I think from a cultural perspective, something that, I also see clients grappling with is the idea of making sure that folks understand that not only is it not punitive, that, oh dear, you might have messed up something and it's exposed the company to risk, but also that it's not judgmental. So maybe you got it wrong. Maybe it was a completely legitimate email, or is a very legitimate scenario. It was something that came in from a vendor that did need to be responded to. So it's not only about whether or not there's an issue on the negative side, it's also making people feel comfortable raising their hand. I think we all have been on plenty of calls or in plenty of meetings where we thought about saying something and then looked at all the eyeballs looking at us and decided perhaps not this time. And I think that that's something really when we start to think about the culture and where you can bring in HR and start to bring in colleagues in different kinds of capacities, because of course, business teams know that they're very busy. So they can only imagine what's going on in the CISO's team. And perhaps some of that leads to a bit of recalcitrance. So we are getting close to the end of our session here, not quite done, but I wanted to first let also anybody chime in. Debbie, I know that you didn't chime in on the training side too much, but to think about if there's, from what you're looking at in the next sort of 12 to 18 months as some of the biggest challenges in this third and fourth, et cetera, party risk space, what's on your radar? And we can take it we'll start with Debbie and we can work our way around the horn.
So I do have an active, we're going to mature our third party risk management process. And as a company, we do a fantastic job of when we onboard a vendor, doing a risk assessment, assessing what the risk is in doing an evaluation of them. Where we need improvement is once the vendor's onboarded. There is no automatic every year look at high risk vendors, and we have a method, because every year we do a GDPR data inventory and we classify every vendor every year. So we just need to take that next step, and again, we have to find a tool, because if I have 2,000 vendors, I don't want to send out and get 2,000 things back. I want to be able to somehow automate sending these questionnaires out and bubble up the important ones where there was a red flag. And that's what's on my radar for this year. Andrea?
Yeah, what I'm keeping an eye on really is the one is sort of seeing the movement towards the fourth and fifth tier, and because I do think that there's been a lot over the last year where companies are looking beyond that tier one now, and so I think that's going to be super important, and seeing how that plays out and how companies go about gaining that visibility is going to be really important. But then on top of that, also looking at for the CISO's job, just how the shifting industrial policies and cybersecurity policies across the globe are going to be impacting CISOs, and that's just everything from the growth of these restrictions that are going on, and in the bans of certain products that it's in the US. India just announced some more bans. It's across Europe. There's a patchwork. Australia, Japan, South Korea. China has their own unreliable list. So there's a back and forth going on with that I think is going to dramatically impact the CISOs. And at the same time, the data protection, like you're talking about, Janelyn, those are popping up as well, and also add a whole nother facet to it as well. And the interesting thing is some of the data protection is under the auspices of data protection, but also is sort of like a way for government to access the data. It sounds good on the surface, but then it turns out it's not. So it's just really looking at how all that's shifting over the next 12, 18 months is also what I'll be keeping an eye on.
Monica?
Sure. So, I guess building on that, really when you're looking at these risks, third party, fourth party, fifth, like down the line, it's really, you have to risk rank everything, and you have to put your focus in your higher risk areas just in order to make it manageable. You can't boil the ocean, but you have to put your energy into the areas that you have the most risk, depending on what they're doing for you and your company. That's kind of my parting thoughts.
And Vicky.
So I definitely will be focusing in on the IT organization involved as early as I possibly can in any kind of thought process with respect to solving IT challenges and any kind of procurements. The organization, we really kind of let folks in the business go out and purchase services that they want externally. We offer them up wonderful IT services internally, but they do have that option. And so my challenge is making sure that even if they're thinking about using an external vendor, that we still are able to be a part of the conversation and hopefully can drive good solution selection and development, as well as then also address the security concerns.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have like 2 minutes left before apparently the screen goes dark and we get cut off. So I just thought it would be a good opportunity for me to do a little bit of summarizing of some of the interesting things that I've heard. It sounds to me as though from a sort of nuts and bolts perspective, one of the most important things for organizations to have is a vendor classification system in place. All of our conversation has been predicated on the difference between higher risk, business urgency, and being able to sort of separate where you really need to be focused from areas that you can get to in an appropriate amount of time. And it also sounds to me as though there is going to be a wide swathe of collaboration happening between the CISO's office and the rest of the organization. And I do think that I think it's something that the pandemic probably helped us usher in, but there's definitely a different vibe towards collaboration that I've seen with my clients as well, where there's an awareness that teams need to work together because so much of this is now interrelated and the dependencies are just so obviously there. And again, from the things that Andrea was saying with respect to the policy shifts, businesses definitely need to be keeping an eye on the sectors where they operate and also the sectors where their vendors operate, because it seems as though we might have some significant legislation continue to pop up I also, of course, always want to put a bit of a privacy plug in, but absolutely when you start to think about data localization and the restrictions being put in place there, it is never too early for any of the multinationals on the phone or anybody who's using vendors in other countries to start to think about what the impact is. Because as Andrea said, for a lot of these countries, this is just a very thinly veiled way in which government can start to peel back the layers of protection of your information, of your security, of your IP. And this is definitely something that security teams are going to need to have a greater awareness of. And again, maybe that collaboration with the privacy teams or the legal teams, as well as the procurement teams, to make sure that vendors being chosen locally are in position to help protect that data, since they will actually be the feet on the street. I think that we're pretty much at time. If there are any other last questions from the audience, we'd be more than happy, if there is a moment to take them. Otherwise, I'd like to thank the panel, and I see that Kim's popped on, so I'd like to turn it over to her for closing remarks.